Hi, and welcome to episode 2 from the Stewards room. I was glad to see that a good few of you really enjoyed the first episode, found it informative, and perhaps looked at things from an angle you perhaps hadn't looked at things from before. So a few more for this week. Just if you haven't seen the episode before, the premise is really that pretty much every night I'll go back through the Stewards reports for the day, mainly with a view to looking at if any of my selections have underperformed, if there was a reason offered, or if a horse that I hadn't considered to be a danger had won the race, if there was a reason offered for the improvement in form. There often are reasons given which you can then factor in for your calculations for next time. So there's a few for this week, and we'll get started. The first one was from the 3rd of February at Chepstow, and a few people actually tagged me in this on Twitter and a couple of comments on the YouTube video, and it was the performance of Hip Hop d'Angray, trained by Robert Walford. And the Stewards report reads that the performance of Hip Hop d'Angray was considered, given that he started favourite but could only finish 8th of 13, beaten around 19 lengths. Robert Walford could offer no explanation for the performance, and the vet officer found no abnormalities in a routine examination. I think that's quite strange, personally, that Robert Walford could offer no explanation, because I think there was plenty of evidence as to why it went badly. He simply didn't jump. He backed off the first, didn't really get a cut at that, was pretty careful throughout with his jumping, made a notable error down the back straight, which he actually did quite well, I thought, to pick up from a match back onto the main group, but then very careful jumps, 5 out and 4 out, had him on the back foot, and he could never really get into a place to challenge. Now, a couple of the tweets that I was tagged in sort of angled that people were unhappy with the ride Daryl Jacob had delivered, and I can see where you're coming from if you feel like that. He certainly didn't get vigorous with Hip Hop d'Angray when the mistakes came. Some jockeys, David Bass, for example, Harry Skelton, would be quite positive and make a horse's mind up if it wasn't jumping well enough, and that can work. But I think you have to consider that Robert Walford has chosen a certain type of jockey for this horse. It might well be that he's not had a great deal of confidence with his jumping, and Daryl Jacob is in a situation there where if he feels the confidence is ebbing away in a race, he's either got to grab hold of him and really throw him down to a fence and hope that the horse reacts and gets a bit of adrenaline surge and a bit of confidence from a big leap and picks up again. But the flip side of that is if that doesn't happen and the horse ends up on the floor, you're in a position where the horse is already fragile, confidence is dented further, and that can not only wipe out one race, it can then wipe out the rest of your season. So I think there was probably consideration gone into what Daryl Jacob was doing. I think he was trying to nurse the horse back together and let him find his feet. It just looked to me from the outset that it was all happening a bit quick for this horse, which is unusual given that his win had come at Fontwell, which is a sharper track than Chepstow. You would have thought Chepstow would have suited a bit more on that occasion, but I don't think he's a horse completely right off. I think he's definitely got to improve his jumping. Whether they'll look to go up in trip a little bit now and hopefully things happening a little bit slower will help him, but there was no effort, no explanation offered. I do think that's strange. I think it would have been perfectly reasonable for Robert Walford to come in and say he didn't jump well, which you see plenty of times offered as a reason for a poor run, but that's the reason I can find. He'd be one to keep an eye on. I probably wouldn't be keen to back him at short odds, certainly next time, but that's Hip Hop d'Angray, the 3rd of February at Chepstow. The following day, the 4th of February at Sandown, and this is not particularly relevant to me as a horse that I gave up on some time ago, but I thought it was just interesting as to the difference in the level of information that can be provided by trainers. So it relates to a horse called Puerto Rico, who never really travelled and was pulled up the home straight at Sandown in the 3:30. Then on the 6th of February, trainer Tom Gretton reported that Puerto Rico had subsequently scoped dirty post-race. So they've obviously taken him home, done a bit of an MOT, and the scope has come back as dirty. Now, Puerto Rico is a real enigma of a horse. He runs badly more often than he runs well. So it isn't particularly relevant to this horse because it doesn't matter to me that he scoped dirty last time. He's just not a horse that I get involved with. But it would shape my opinion on horses from that yard in general. If one horse scopes dirty, it can be that there's low-grade infection. Horses are a bit like school kids. If one gets a snotty nose, they all tend to get a snotty nose. So while I wouldn't, as a blanket sort of rule, say, that's it, Tom Gretton's horses, can't touch them, I certainly would factor it in to any consideration going forward. If I fancy a Tom Gretton horse, I would just add that into the mix and be comfortable that there is a chance that the yard could be slightly out of form. Am I still happy taking the offered odds in the race, etc. Then also on the 4th of February at Wetherby, the 240. And this concerns Ballygriffin Cottage. Now, I actually tipped as a next best the winner of this race, City Chief. And I just thought it was interesting to sort of hit on that City Chief won. My inclination for opposing Ballygriffin Cottage was that all his best form had come on softer ground, and I felt he might get put under pressure on this good ground. But I think it's important when you have a bet that you don't just assume that a winning bet is a good bet and a losing bet is a bad bet. I think that's a very dangerous road to go down. So Ballygriffin Cottage was well beaten, but I like to go back and check whether my logic was sound. And it was subsequently reported that he'd bled from the nose, and that's a bit chicken and egg, because a horse can bleed if it's put under a lot of pressure, which my inclination was that was going to happen to this horse in this race. I didn't think he'd bleed, but I thought he'd be put under pressure on this better ground going a little bit quicker, and I questioned whether he'd be suitable for that. But there is, of course, the chance that he was slightly under the weather, and that's why he performed like that. And because he was under weather, he then bled. That you'll never know, but I thought that was an important consideration. And then just while we're on it, let's discuss what bleeding is. I thought I'd dig out a couple of numbers. So there's 75 gallons of blood going round a horse at gallop, and 19 gallons of oxygen every minute. The heart can get up to about 220 beats per minute, and each beat is pumping 3 pints of blood around the body. Now the blood vessels, the capillaries in the lungs, are having to withstand that enormous pressure of that blood being pumped around the body. They're a very thin surface with a very fine membrane, and on occasion that membrane can break, and that's what bleeding is. The horse ends up with a bit of blood down into its respiratory system, down into its lungs, which, as you can imagine, is not optimal for good function of the lungs. There's schools of thoughts as to how bad bleeding is. I know there's some trainers that think that if a horse is bled at home, for example, the time to run it is fairly soon, because they're not going to bleed that quick in succession. Personally, my thought is that bleeders need time. The way it was explained to me is that, like any cut, it needs to heal and it needs time to heal, and they can leave a scar. And it's those that scar that tend to become prone to bleeding again. So Ballygriffin Cottage certainly wouldn't be on my blacklist, but I think he perhaps needs conditions softer. That's only hard in my opinion, and under less pressure. But that was the reason for his poor run. It's up to you to decide whether that better ground and that increased pace put him under pressure and caused him to bleed or not. And then the last one from the Stewards reports this week is on the 7th of February, the 1:15 at Market Raisin, and the performance of Escobedo, which finished 6th of 8th, beaten 70 lengths, was considered. The representative trainer, Milson Harris, explained the gelding had not stayed the 2 mile 4 trip on this occasion, and they also added that Escobedo had made a respiratory noise. Now, this horse races in a tongue tie. He's not previously had a wind up. He would now be on my list. It goes into my notes. I wouldn't be considering him unless he's had a wind up. If the same thing was written about a horse that hadn't previously worn a tongue tie, if a tongue tie was added next time, that would perhaps give me reason to consider them. Tongue tie can often help a horse with its breathing. this horse has raced in a tongue tie a good number of times now, so it would seem that the next logical step is to get his wind investigated and give him a procedure if at all possible. If that happens, I'd happily consider him. And I would also have it in my notes that the time he didn't stay 2 mile 4, or appear to stay 2 mile 4, he also had a respiratory issue. So it could be, if that respiratory issue is sorted, 2 mile 4 won't be a problem in the future. And I think if you were backing him at market rates on this occasion, you were probably doing so on the fact that over 2 miles he'd appeared to stay very well and looked to be crying out for that step up in trip. So that'd be the sort of thing I'd add to my notes about that horse, that, you know, if he has a wind up, maybe 2 mile 4 is not out of the question in the future. And then to finish up with, I had a question put on the YouTube video from last week from Daniel Watkins, who asked about the Clarence House Chase, where Editor Gite won and beat the slightly disappointing Energy. And Dan said that he'd looked on the BHA website and he'd seen that the only mention in the Stewards report was that Amarillo Sky had finished lame, and there was no sort of report about the apparent poor performance of Energy. And did I think that was interesting or relevant? And I think really they haven't looked at it because Energy was there challenging at the last, and to all intents and purposes it was a poor jump at the last that knocked him back and saw him beaten as far as he was. So I don't think that's relevant. I think that's why they left it. But that said, I think it's worth noting that in the media reports in the next couple of days after the Clarence House Chase, there was sort of this reason given that the white railings that we now have on the front of fence in the UK versus the orange in Ireland caused Energy sort of take a bit of a fright at the first and jump up in the air. And they sort of, you know, suggested that might not have been to his liking and that he'll be better for that next time. It's the sort of thing that if the stewards had asked, they might have found out and would have been more readily available than relying on the yard to offer it up to the media. For what it's worth, I think in the race, I don't think it was Paul Townend's finest moment. I thought Energy jumped really well, bar the first fence, but he was jumping exuberantly, and every time he landed, he was having to get taken back off heels because he was being ridden quite patiently in fourth. I thought it was an inspired ride by Niall Houlihan to kick off the bend, and I think Paul Townend perhaps didn't realise just how strong a stay Editor Gite is over this trip. I would fully expect him in the Queen Mother Champion Chase now to help make the running, if not make the running on his own, where they can use that jumping to better effect. Particularly now he's seen those white fronted fences, and he should be okay with them second time round. So that's a wrap up of the Stewards reports this week from the Stewards room. As ever, please like, please share, please subscribe to this video and send to anyone you think might be interested. And if you've seen anything this week that you think the stewards have missed, or you want to know why the stewards thought what they thought, then drop a message in the comments and I'll take a look at it next week.